Alright, so in this video we're talking about secondary dominant chords, a simple trick that makes your chord progression sound a little bit more interesting. If you've ever heard a song being played and you've heard an interesting but weird chord and you're wondering how does this actually make sense, because it does make sense and it sounds really good, chances are it's a secondary dominant chord. So in this video we'll talk about what they are, how to find these secondary dominants, and most importantly, how to use them in your guitar playing. Alright, let's dive in. So firstly, what's a dominant chord? A dominant chord is essentially a major chord with a strong pull to another chord. And the most common dominant chord is your 5/7 chord, which actually resolves to the 1. So let's say we are in the key of C. Our dominant chord, being our 5/7, would be our G7, resolving to our C. So a secondary dominant chord is another dominant chord that targets another chord, which is not our 1 chord. It makes that chord feel like home, feel like that point that you're trying to get to. So again, in the key of C, our dominant chord is our G7. However, a secondary dominant could be an E7 that's resolving to an A minor. So a secondary dominant targets a different chord, a chord that is not our 1. This could be our 2, it could be our 3, or 4 chord, or 5 chord, or even our 6 chord. Let's find the secondary dominant chords for each one of those specific degrees. So in the key of C, our 5/7 chord is G7, which resolves to C. However, let's look at our 2 chord, which is our D minor, and the 5/7 of D minor is A7. So A7 resolving to our D minor makes our D minor feel stronger, and A7 acts as a secondary dominant in the key of C, preparing to go to that D minor. So let's hear that in context. So let's talk about finding secondary dominants. What's the formula? Well, it's actually the 5/7 of any chord. So to find a secondary dominant, take any chord within the key and ask yourself, what's the 5/7 of this chord? So again, in the key of C, my dominant 7 or 5/7 is G7. My 2 is D minor, and the 5/7 of D minor is A7. My 3 is E minor, and the 5/7 of E minor is B7. The 4, F, and the 5/7 of that is C7. G being my 5, the 5/7 is D7. And the 6, A minor, and my 5/7 of A minor is E7. So that means that 5 goes to 1, 6 goes to 2, 7 goes to 3, 1 goes to 4, 2 goes to 5, and 3 goes to 6. So what this actually gives us is the circle of fifths. So if you're familiar with the circle of fifths, that's exactly what's going on here. So to remember it, think 7, 3, 6, 2, 5, 1, 4. And that's a really nice progression that especially you'll hear a lot in gospel music. For example, there I started with the 4, went 7, 3, 6, 2, 5, 1, and then back to the 4 again. So let's play a basic 1, 4, 5, 1 progression. Now let's add a secondary dominant that's taking us from that 1 to the 4. how that C7 really sets up the change from that C to that F by adding that additional color, which is that secondary dominant effect that we're talking about. So let's take it a step further and talk about stacking secondary dominants. And yes, you can actually stack them. So a 2-5-1 is actually stacking two secondary dominants, or technically one, because you're stacking your secondary dominant onto your primary dominant. But let's add a 3, then a 6, then the 2, then the 5, and then the 1. So let's actually play that and see how that actually sounds. So there you'll notice that 3-6-2-5-1 at the end, and that's actually a very, very common gospel and jazz movement. Notice how all those chords are really, really targeting the one chord and driving home and making that one chord sound a lot richer. So we've learned about secondary dominants, we've talked about what they are, we've talked about how to find them, and we've talked about the two ways that they can be used. However, let's actually talk about application now. So there are two main ways I know we use secondary dominants in music. The first one is to spice up a basic progression. So let's play a basic 1-5-6-4, and then we'll add a secondary dominant instead of playing our 5. So there you'll see, instead of playing that 5, I opted for the E7, which is taking me to the 6, and then close back the progression on the 4 as normal. So this time we're going to use the same progression, but instead of omitting that 5, we're going to leave it in and just add that 3 before we get to our 6. Let's see what that sounds like. So there you'll notice that I added an extra chord, which is the E7, to the original progression, adding even more dynamics to that progression by spicing it up with the secondary dominant. So the final thing to talk about are turnarounds and passing chords. You can use secondary dominants as your passing chords or as turnarounds, and this is a very common idea in gospel, jazz, and blues. So I'll be playing this song, How Great Is Our God, and we'll be using passing chords and turnarounds to give you an idea of what you could do in your playing. So you might have noticed that I added the 2-5-1 turnaround, but I also added a 7-3-6, even though those chords weren't secondary dominants. If you want to find out exactly what I did there, subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next video.